Hi, so I'm Katie and I'm a PhD student at the School of Education in the University of Worcester, and my research is primarily focused on how beginning primary school teachers construct their identities through discourse. And this paper draws from findings from data that I collected in 2019. So this was before the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think the findings are highly relevant as they illuminate how beginning teachers, and possibly all teachers, think about their role as educators as being involved in preparing students for the future. So the COVID-19 event has certainly disrupted our sense that this future is kind of stable or knowable. And I think this poem, The Second Coming, sort of captures that sense of instability for me. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. So I kept coming back to this poem as the COVID-19 event sort of happened. Interestingly, if you read Elizabeth Outker's recently published book, Viral Modernism, she has a chapter on how she interprets this poem as being a response to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. So that's kind of the reason why I chose this title, but you'll see in a minute another reason why. So let me see if I can move this on. Right, so in 2019, I conducted these focus groups with beginning primary school teachers in 4 different schools. And as part of this focus group, teachers were asked to rank different characteristics and roles of teachers in order of importance. So this is one of the ranking activities that was completed in the focus group. The point was really to promote discussion about what was important to teachers. And here you can see the outcome of one of these ranking activities. And the teachers in this school have placed in the middle, prepare their students for the future as the most important thing they have to do as a teacher. This was considered a really important part of being a teacher in all the focus groups I ran, and 2 focus groups put this at the centre of their grid, indicating it was the most important aspect of being a teacher. So this sort of attachment to the future that I found in my participant teachers, I found really interesting. I thought before I ran the focus groups that teachers would think preparing their students for the future was important, but what surprised me was how important they considered this to be. For a lot of teachers, this was clearly at the centre of their teaching practice. It was why they understood teaching to be important. So I revisited Lee Edelman's No Future, which presents promises of the future as a disciplinary device deployed to control people in the present. And I think this is the case with teachers. Politicians use promises of this idealized future that can be attained by students if they and their teachers just work hard enough to get people to do what is required within the politics of the time. So we see this here with Michael Gove justifying his curriculum reforms in 2014 by saying we need to secure our children's future in this ever more competitive world. So this scary future world of competitiveness means that all teachers and all students have to do exactly what Michael Gove says. And these curriculum reforms have certainly, well, almost certainly led to a decrease in opportunities to study creative subjects at both primary and secondary level, and an increase in formal teacher-led pedagogies in a lot of schools. I could have picked from a lot of quotes from different education secretaries at this point, but I particularly like this picture of Michael Gove, and I like to wheel it out at every opportunity. So that's why I chose this one in particular. Here is our current Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, and his pet tarantula Cronus, in his speech recently, saying almost exactly the same thing, telling everybody to get back to school in September. He says, getting our children back to school is part of our national recovery, and our children's futures depend on this. So he's using the same disciplinary device. Our national recovery and the futures of individual children depend on us getting back to school. So that's what must happen, although that might mean that the safety of people in the present might be put at risk. So now I'm going to look back at some of the statements made during my focus groups, which I referred to at the beginning. I'm going to start with just some simple statements, teachers indicating their attachment to preparing students for the future. So all the names here, Isabella, Nicole, the names of the schools, they're all anonymous. They've all been anonymised, they're all pseudonyms. So anyway, Nicole here says that preparing students for the future is non-negotiable. And Grace uses this adjectival intensifier, absolutely. Zoe also uses an adjectival intensifier, very, to show their commitment to preparing their students to the future. So this just shows how well that disciplinary device of sort of future preparation works. These teachers are just completely sold on the idea that their job is to prepare students for the future. So when I started digging a little bit deeper into what was involved in preparing students for the future, it was clear that many teachers associated future preparation with school readiness. So getting children ready for the next stage of their education. So you see this here with Isabella saying, I'm teaching year four, so making sure they're year 5 ready because year 5 is their future. So in this way, schools are constructed as a sort of factory, so an assembly line where every teacher prepares their students for the next stage. And the question that then leaps out, of course, is when are children done? When are they ready and able to enjoy the fruits of their learning? And I think this quote by Isabella in particular gives a real insight into education in England at the moment, how targets and accountability measures really dominate the lives of teachers and students. Because is being year 5 ready in the grand scheme of things all that important for the child? So lots of research into beginning teachers indicates that teachers enter the profession with grand ideals about the difference they want to make for children. And part of learning to be a teacher is sort of negotiating this mismatch between those ideals and reality. But I would say that this quote kind of shows how big a mismatch that is when such a great focus of somebody's working life is on making sure children are year 5 ready. For more on this, Perriman and Calvert wrote an excellent article that's just recently been published about what motivates people to teach and why they leave. One teacher said, there is little creativity and fun in my daily job, and I worry that all schools are just becoming so target driven. And this is what we see here in this quote by Isabella. Targets to get children ready for the following year, sort of overwhelming the bigger picture about what the purpose of education is. So Julia was the only teacher who participated in a focus group who rejected the idea of preparing students for the future. She said it's not even about preparing for the future, it's preparing them for now. She was an early years teacher and her school had introduced a planning in the moment scheme to help teachers to focus on the present when working with children. And yet, if you look at what Julia is saying here, everything is still quite focused on school readiness, and therefore is essentially still beholden to this futurity discourse. The things that Julia is valuing as a teacher, forming the S correctly, holding a pencil correctly, this isn't valuing what children who are 4 years old necessarily value. This is preparing students for the future again, getting them ready for year 1. So rather than focusing on what children can do in the present, Julia is completely focused on getting them ready to learn in the future, which creates a sort of deficit construction of children, focusing not on what they're able to do, but what they need to do yet. So for an alternative approach, you could look at the Reggio Emilia schools in northern Italy, which were founded in the aftermath of the Second World War, so a big crisis. And these schools are much more orientated towards children's accomplishments in the present, constructing children as able, agential learners. So going back to the focus group with Isabella and Nicole, I introduced this idea of interrupted futures, using the example of children who have terminal illnesses. For these children, education should and must mean something more than preparing for the future. Isabella's reaction to this idea, and which Nicole agreed to, was to argue that the education of children who have terminal illnesses should look very different to a normal education, allowing them to enjoy the moment and be creative and imaginative. But this response raises questions about the divide between those who are healthy and those who are sick, a divide which of course becomes less clear during a global pandemic. But of course that divide exists at all times. That the majority of children are denied a creative and imaginative education which they can enjoy in the moment because it is considered more worthwhile for them to be preparing for their future is hugely problematic, because we simply don't know which children have a long future ahead of them and which don't. Here in a focus group at Daffodil School, Bethany also talks in a similar way about the present as a preparation for the future, in a way which diminishes the importance of the present. Talking about a boy in her class with behavioural issues, she says it is important that she teaches him how to behave, because although in the present he will have no friends if he carries on punching them, so controlling his anger is important in the present, it is more important for him to control his anger in the future, when punching someone will mean he's going to get put in jail. The relationship between the present and the future here is constructed as the present being a rehearsal for the future, sort of removed and somehow separate. Getting it right in the present doesn't really matter in that case. It's just a rehearsal for the real thing in the future, when it does matter. But another way of thinking about the present is as more connected to the future, deeply informing how the future turns out. In this case, by learning to be kind in the present, this child would learn the value of kindness, the good things he gets out of being kind, and this would encourage him to continue these traits in the future. In this way, the present is an educative experience, promoting the development and maintenance of virtuous characteristics in the future. But it's not separate, it's not a rehearsal. The two are intimately linked, with the present deeply informing the future. So I'll end with Dewey, who's often associated with experiential or progressive education, who argued that an educative curriculum was one in which present experiences live fruitfully and creatively in subsequent experiences. Dewey rejected this idea of education being a separate rehearsal for future experiences. For Dewey, present experience deeply informed the future. And I think this is what is missing sometimes in education at the moment. The orientation and attachment to the future that we see, which I encountered in my research interviews, but I also encountered when I was a primary school teacher. I saw it when I was an early years teacher. I think it's damaging because I think it constructs present learning as needing to be formal and enjoyable and teacher driven in order to prepare children for the future, making them school ready. But this risks denying children's agency, creativity and enthusiasm, and consequently damaging the possibility of them flourishing in future learning experiences. So thanks for listening. This is going to be published in the future, so if you want a copy of it, just PM or email me and I'll send one on. Thank you.